There is plenty to talk with Leith Van Alslen this week from Macro Business. A lot of economic news, including what the IMF had to say yesterday. But Leith, we will start with housing, and I think what it's a good way to describe what's happening, particularly in Sydney, is a conundrum. It's almost a catch-22 that we don't have enough people to build houses, but we bring more people from overseas, and then they don't have anywhere to live.
That's right, mate. Yeah, look, it's very interesting. So last week, Citigroup held an investment conference, and it was attended by Mirvac, which is obviously a major residential developer in Australia. And its CEO said that there aren't enough builders to build the homes that we need because governments are too busy building infrastructure. And New South Wales Treasurer Daniel Mookhey agreed, and he also told the conference, he followed up, and he said that big build infrastructure projects are diverting labour away from housing, and he said that governments need to reduce its infrastructure spending. And this echoed what the New South Wales Productivity Commission said last month, when it basically told state governments to pare back infrastructure investment in order to free construction to build homes. Now, the interesting thing about this, Clinton, is that at the same time as you have these three parties all saying that we've got to build less infrastructure and so that we've got more labour to build housing, the Committee for Sydney released their own report, and that called for more infrastructure spending. So it said that Sydney's going to need to build hundreds more metro train and light rail stations in order to tackle the housing crisis. And it said that basically Sydney will need to deliver a new metro rail line or tram line every 4 to 6 years in Sydney. And this was countered by Premier Chris Minns, who said there's just not enough money to pay for that investment. And the Committee for Sydney's chief, Eamon Waterford, said that basically Sydney has no choice and that it's going to take several decades to solve the housing crisis. And Sydney has no choice, and that basically governments are going to have to spend huge amounts of money to build more infrastructure to support the population growth. So we have this conundrum here whereby, a whole bunch of people are saying we need to build less infrastructure to divert that to housing. We've got the Committee of Sydney saying, no, we need more infrastructure to cope with the population growth. And it just brings you back to this whole point that I seem to talk about every single week, Clinton, is that if the federal government's going to continue to fire hose huge volumes of migrants into Australia every year, we're going to need more infrastructure and more housing. You can't trade off one for the other. It's not an either-or proposition. And you can't, if we divert labour away from infrastructure towards housing, you're basically just robbing Peter to pay Paul. And what none of these commentators bother to mention is that there's a very simple solution to this problem of not enough housing, not enough infrastructure. It's simply to lower immigration.
Yes.
To cut the demand so that you don't have to build as much housing and you don't have to build as much infrastructure. But unfortunately, none of these commentators are honest enough to look at the immigration elephant in the room that is basically causing the problem in the first place. And instead, they seem to be happy to go down this road of basically forcing, future residents of Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, etc., to live in expensive high-rise shoeboxes with not enough infrastructure, because we don't have the labour to do both. We can't build enough houses and infrastructure. That's obvious, which is why these groups are fighting with themselves. So the obvious solution is to reduce demand and reduce the immigration intake, so therefore we can build enough infrastructure and we can build enough housing. Because if we keep going down this road, we're just going to have this perpetual problem of housing shortages and then also more congested infrastructure. And it's just a recipe for, declining living standards.
And look, the tricky thing with infrastructure, you mentioned metros there, but same thing with motorways. It's long term. It takes a decade to build a metro line effectively. Now, the Minns government, Chris Minns, has been clear from the start of his term that he's not going to be an infrastructure premier. He's going to be dealing with other issues. Reality is the political landscape in New South Wales is, I'll declare it now, I don't think this is a shock, this will be at least a two-term Labor government. So that's 8 years. Liberals won't win the next election. That's 8 years. So that if there needs to be those metro train lines, that actually puts 8 years onto it.
That's right. And the thing is that this is going to have to be done over, many governments over many, cycles, because this is all long-term investment here. But ultimately, it gets down to, where's the money going to come from to pay for this stuff? Where's the labour and materials going to come from? And if we do go down this road of building all these extra metro train lines and etc. It's A, it's going to cost a hell of a lot of money, but B, it's going to create this other problem where it's going to divert all the labour away from building housing, which is then going to rob the housing system, and we're going to end up with deepening housing shortages. So ultimately, the problem of infrastructure and housing gets back to too many people coming into Australia and creating the problem in the first place. It gets down to excessive demand. And the fact of the matter is, Sydney's projected to grow to about 8.5 million people by 2060. So, you're looking at another 3 million people, roughly. And obviously, if you're going to have 3 million more people, you're going to need a hell of a lot more housing and infrastructure. It's as simple as that. And all that population growth is going to come from immigration. And if you don't think that you can build enough housing infrastructure, well, then don't bring in the people. Bring in 1 million instead of 3 million. It's all so obvious. Yet, the Mirvac, obviously Mirvac's a vested interest. They're a property developer. They never want less people coming in because that's, not good for them. But you got Daniel Mookie here. You got the New South Wales Productivity Commission, and then you've got the Committee of Sydney. They should all be honest enough to say that this is an immigration problem, first and foremost, because demand is simply running way ahead of supply. And by supply, I mean the supply of housing and the supply of infrastructure. And clearly, we can't do both. You can't build enough housing and enough infrastructure to keep up this runaway population growth. We haven't done it for 20 years, and there is no signs that we'll be able to do it in the future. So therefore, the solution is you've got to lower demand.
Now,
as simple as that.
The IMF has now released their World Economic Report, and I note they said that basically the world inflation, they've broken the back, or the world has broken the back of the inflation problem, but inflation is still an issue in Australia in particular. And the fear for Australia is the economic growth rate is not flash.
No, it's not. So the IMF released their World Economic Outlook, and it predicted that Australia's economy in aggregate terms will only grow by 1.2% in 2004. And this follows on from the OECD's most recent economic outlook, which was released about a month ago. And that also reduced Australia's GDP growth prediction to 1.1%, so it was even more negative. And Deloitte also released their economic outlook, and that was also 1.1% for this calendar year. So, yes, that's growth, but the problem is the population, as of the latest labour market release, was growing at 2.3%, and CBA predicts that by the end of the year it'll be growing at 2%. So all this means is that Australia's already experienced its longest per capita recession on record. So the Australian economy, once you strip out population growth, has gone backwards for 6 consecutive quarters. And based on these projections, whether it's the IMF, OECD or Deloitte, this per capita recession is going to extend well into next year. So what is already the longest per capita recession in Australia's history is going to extend even longer. And what makes it more remarkable, Clinton, is that I think the only things that are holding up the economy is obviously population growth, but also we've got record government spending at the moment. So thanks to the NDIS and obviously the record infrastructure spending, the share of Australia's growth coming from the public sector is actually at a record high. It's never been higher. And Westpac actually predicts that it's going to continue rising for the next several quarters to new record highs. So despite the fact that we've got this record government spending, we're still in a per capita recession, which is quite remarkable. And what that tells you is that the private sector is actually going backwards. And obviously households are going backwards. So the latest labour force data that came out last week showed that we've had zero growth in hours worked in the market sector or the private sector in the last year. And all of Australia's 1.5% increase in hours worked across the economy has been in the non-market sector or what they call the government-aligned sector. So that's areas of the economy that are dependent on government spending, like health and things like that. So this is a pretty sick economy we've got here. It's already going backwards. As I said, the longest per capita recession on record. It's going to extend for longer, for probably 2 to 3 more quarters based on these forecasts. And yet the economy's been propped up like it never has before on public spending, which means that the private sector is getting hammered even harder. So this is it's a pretty diabolical economy we've got here. And I think, obviously the record immigrations alongside the record public spending are the only things that are preventing the overall economy from sliding into a technical recession, even though we are all going backwards, obviously, because of this higher population growth. So it's a it's not a great picture.
And reality is, with an election year next year, we're not going to see the federal government dramatically cut spending, I think it's fair to say. We can certainly read all about it through Macro Business. Good on you, Leith. We'll talk next week.
Yeah, thanks, Clinton. Speak to you next time.
Leith Van Olsland from Macro Business.